Hello, everybody. How are you? We're fine. Good evening or good afternoon, according to your time there. I will
Good
switch.
afternoon, sir.
This is Namras Abu Saleh. I would like to take you in this discussion about the double standards and failed promises, and the confronting the international response to the genocide in Gaza. We live these hard days all together, and we see the genocide that is happening in Gaza. It's a full HD genocide. As we said in the past, we used to have one photo for a whole. Right now, we're having 100 photos for one victim. It's hard, and I don't want to take too much time to talk about it. Let's start with you guys. Thanks for you being here. We start with Mr. Jim Moran. Jim Moran, former Democratic member of the U.S. House of Representatives. You have the first speech, Mr. Are you with us, Jim Moran?
Yes, I am.
Yes. Welcome. You have the mic. Welcome.
Would you like me to begin talking?
Yes, please.
Okay. I don't know that I've ever been as disappointed in America's response to what is happening in Palestine today. I was disappointed with the Bush administration when it decided to destroy a country, Iraq, after 9/11.
Can you ask me? Can I ask you, sir, to open the camera if it is available?
Come closer to the camera.
No, we cannot see you. We cannot see you.
Oh, you can't see me.
Yeah.
Okay. So but you want me to speak up more loudly?
Yeah. No. Everyone to open the camera. That will be better for the.
Open the camera.
Yeah. Can you open the camera, please? The camera is.
I tried, but it said that the host has blocked it. So I don't know how I'm gonna. Yeah, let me try it again. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you. So this is being recorded, I gather. We're not live.
Yeah, it has been recorded. Yes.
All right. Well, a lot has been happening within the United States, and most of it has not been positive. Yesterday and the day before, we've now spent a day and a half trying to censure the one Palestinian member of the entire Congress. There are 435 members plus 100 senators. So basically, out of 535, you have one Palestinian. And because she is speaking up for the welfare of her constituency, she is being censured. And there were a number of Democrats and virtually all Republicans who voted to do so. And so that censure passed. I would have liked to think that we respect everyone's point of view and what we call freedom of speech. That's no longer the case. There have been a number of members of the Congress who want to deport Palestinians, not allow them into the country, all kinds of weird extremist measures. But what is most troubling is that the vast majority of citizens, and certainly of members of Congress, are wholly behind Israel's destruction of property, and particularly of human life. And how they can look the other way and close their consciences to the fact that we now have more than 10,000 deaths, almost 5,000 of those 10,000, 4,800 children have been slaughtered. Children are by definition not responsible for the actions of adults, and certainly not of Hamas terrorists. There are probably 30,000 Hamas terrorists in Gaza. There are 2.3 million people. So 99.9% of the people living in Gaza are not terrorists. And yet all of them have been targeted. 70% of the population has been displaced. I mean, this is another Nakba. This is, from a Palestinian's point of view, it's comparable to a Holocaust where they have nowhere to go and are getting very little empathy from the rest of the world. But the United States, which is the principal source of international empowerment for the Israeli government, wants to do more, wants to give another $14 billion to the Netanyahu government, basically to kill more Palestinians when it comes right down to it. This is a crime against humanity. And
Mr.
I find it extraordinarily troubling.
Mr. Jim Moran, we don't want to go there too much. You know, we have only 5 minutes for everyone. And just to be direct to the point, we want to talk about the genocide and the double standard. And, you know, naming, we don't want to make it Bassem Youssef and Piers Morgan talking like, do you condemn Hamas, what happened? And these, we are away from that. Let's concentrate on the genocide. And because, you know, it's very sensitive situation to talk about a party here or to name people or just to say, you know, finally, civilians has been under fire, and there is no reason to put civilians under fire. Even if you have hostages, you have what you called the militant group, whatever you want. Finally, if there's a war, it should be a military action against a military action. That's what we understand. And you know, and as you mentioned.
Open your mic, Norris. Your mic's closed.
Yeah. Can you hear me, guys? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So we want to we will have questions at the end for everyone. So just to keep the time, I am moderator, so I have to keep the time and to keep the things going direct to the point. Mr. Matt Carthy, respected editor from Dala of Ireland. Is that right? Yes. Welcome, Mr. Matt.
Thank you very much, sir. And yes, I'm speaking to you from the Irish Parliament, where we have just had a debate on this issue. And ironically, we had a debate this time last week. And this time last week, we were commenting on the fact that 5,000 people were then reported to have been killed by Israeli airstrikes on Gaza. This week, the figure is well over 10,000. And I think it is important that we reflect on that for a moment. More people have been killed in a single week than were killed in the entire conflict in the north of Ireland, which lasted for almost 30 years. More people were killed by Israel in 7 days than were killed by all actors in the conflict in the north of Ireland over 3 decades. So the scale of what we are seeing in Gaza is incomprehensible to many of us. Of those who have been killed by Israel, as Mr. Moran has said, over 4,000 have been children, over 600 have been elderly people, almost 3,000 of them have been adult women, and it's continuing. And the world is continuing to allow it to happen. There are estimates that there are 2,800 Palestinian civilians currently under rubble, including 1,300 children. And I say estimates because we cannot know the precise numbers, because the bombardment is continuing and because of fuel shortages and communication difficulties arising from the Israeli siege of Gaza. My fundamental objection is that virtually every single Western leader that has commented on this matter has begun with the words, Israel has the right, and it flows from there. And I think it is very important now that the international community makes it clear that Israel does not have the right to engage in ferocious, aggressive assault against innocent civilian population. It doesn't, and Israel does not have the right to forcibly displace over 1.5 million people. Israel, and I can't believe that this even needs to be said, but Israel does not have the right to target and bomb hospitals, to bomb schools, to bomb mosques, and Israel doesn't have the right, nobody has the right to destroy refugee camps, killing entire families. These are rights that no one has, not Hamas, not Russia, and not Israel. And we were all outraged by the attacks on Israeli civilians last month, and our calls for ceasefires include a call on Hamas, and we repeat our call for all hostages to be immediately released. But if the outrage and condemnation of killing of an innocent Israeli child is not matched by equal outrage and condemnation at the killing of an innocent Palestinian child, then the entire basis of international law is cut to shreds. If international and world leaders stand silent when 90 UNRWA staff are killed by Israel, when 192 healthcare personnel are killed by Israel, when 36 civil defense personnel are killed by Israel, when 47 journalists are killed by Israel, where does the authority to ever again point the finger at other hostile, aggressive action in another part of the world? I'm proud to say that Ireland, united politically, has called for a ceasefire, and that is the right demand. And unfortunately, and it gives me no joy to say this, we're in a minority of EU states in that regard. And I would say shame on those who have refused to back this most basic of humanitarian calls. But the positive, if there is a positive, is that we are clearly within a majority of humanity. The UN General Assembly has overwhelmingly adopted a resolution calling for ceasefires. And we know, of course, that Israel has ignored that call. And if anything, Israel has intensified its indiscriminate and illegal actions. And apart from the horror that we are seeing unfold in Gaza, the ongoing Israeli assaults on the West Bank exposes to me the lie that this is a war against Hamas. This is a war that is aimed at finally destroying the Palestinian people. We know that the Israeli Prime Minister has indicated that Israel intends to occupy Gaza. So the natural questions that flow from debates like this is, what are we going to do about it? The calls for ceasefires must intensify. We must repeat that demand at every single opportunity. But we also need to take political action. There needs to be economic, political, and diplomatic response internationally, because if we don't, then the inference is clear. If we don't take action against these blatant breaches of international law, well, then what we're saying is that, in fact, our outrage at the killing of an Israeli child isn't matched by our outrage at the killing of a Palestinian child. And I have huge concern as to what that means for international law and for the UN Charter if we allow that to become the new standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Matt Carthy. We need to move to Mr. Ken Roth. Ken Roth is here. Hello. Okay, so Ken Roth is not here. Adam Shapiro, the director of Republic of Israel Palestine at Dawn.
Thank you. So thank you first to my previous colleagues who spoke, and to those who come after, and for this opportunity. I'd like to take a slightly different approach, which is to the premise of this is that there are double standards when it comes to genocide. And I think we should first acknowledge that there is a very strong double standard going on right now, contemporaneous to what's happening in Gaza, which is what's going on with Ukraine and the Western and particularly American support for the efforts in Ukraine to fight against an aggressive power, a power that has taken over and annexed territory, and that is committing war crimes and possibly worse in Ukraine. And compare that to what's happening in Palestine, not just Gaza, but all over Palestine. That's a clear double standard. But when it comes to the issue of genocide, I think that we have a different issue at hand, which is not one of double standard, but actually one of consistency. And if we go back more than now, I guess 30 years or so, when we look at the Rwanda genocide, when there were clear warnings issued to the West, and we saw complete inaction until it was too late. When we've seen other such places, such as Darfur, about 20 years ago, where there were clear warnings in place, and there was a complete lack of interest and concern until it was too late. And as we've just seen under this current Biden administration and the previous Trump administration together, we've seen potential genocide and certainly genocidal acts and seems to be incitement to a genocide in Ethiopia, Tigray. We've seen it in just a few weeks before what happened in Gaza, in Artsakh, between the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians. The permission to commit genocide exists in the international system despite international law. And as Mr. McCarthy indicated, we do really have to question if international law, if international humanitarian law is anything more than words on paper at this point, not only because of the permission that we've seen given to actors to commit genocide, but also the tools that have been set up to investigate and prosecute through the ICC have been rendered almost completely meaningless, except in the most sort of colonial approaches towards prosecuting weak or particularly those countries in Africa and the global South, as opposed to with the notable exception recently of Vladimir Putin in Russia. But that's again fitting certain Western interests to do that. I would also say that in terms of Palestinian experience, what we are seeing here is also not an exception. The encirclement of Gaza City by Israel echoes back to the 1982 encirclement of Beirut, when at the time the PLO was effectively the way Israel portrays Hamas today in many ways. And as a result, at that time, the solution that the Americans helped foster was to evacuate the PLO from Lebanon and take all of the fighters out and remove them and take them to another place. And many held that at the moment as a potentially useful thing for the Americans to do. However, 1 month after the PLO was taken out of Lebanon or taken out of Beirut, the Sabra and Shatila massacre occurred as the Israelis allowed and facilitated Phalangist militias to come in and massacre Palestinians. I'd also like to just throw out there that from my perspective, at least, and this is my personal perspective, what we are witnessing in Palestine is not, Mr. Moran indicated that it's another Nakba. What I would actually suggest is that, and Palestinians have said, is that this is actually an ongoing Nakba. And as such, it's an ongoing genocide for 75 years. And what we have today is a spike in violence, for sure. But at the same time, this spike in violence is happening in Gaza in the way it is. Just a few days ago, in the village of Wadi Asir, 200 Palestinians were expelled from their village in the West Bank on foot, leaving only with their goats and other animals and their children and carrying what they could on their backs. And this is not the only incident in the West Bank. I think more than 2,000 people at this point have been forcibly forced to leave their homes and villages in the West Bank, which is a rising number of Palestinians in the West Bank being forced. This is a 75-year process, and I think one of the best ways to understand it is that it's a settler colonial effort to take over as much land as possible with as few people as possible. And as such, we need to understand it both in terms of genocide and in terms of settler colonialism in order to be able to come up with practical, effective solutions to this. I would just add that in the case with Israel, unlike many of the other instances from history, the United States primarily and other countries in the West not only have no interest in helping, they also seem intent on encouraging and supporting, as you indicated, through the provision of weaponry and other financial aid that enables all of this to happen.
Thank you, Mr. Adam. Jonathan Purcell, right? Yes, from Dedicated Public Affairs and Communications Affairs at International Center of Justice for Palestinians. You have the mic, sir.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. Before diving into the political and legal analysis of this situation, I think it's important to take a quick step back. 11,400 people have been killed in a single month in Israel and Palestine, and over 10,000 of them have been Palestinians. One of the problems with talking about killings on such a massive scale is that it's so easy to dehumanize people by referring to them only as numbers. It's genuinely hard to make sense of this scale of suffering. And when these numbers are thrown around, I think it's important to remember that each one of these people were loved by friends and families. They had past memories and future dreams. When politicians from across the world talk about Israel's unequivocal right to defend itself, or when they talk about how it's too early to call for a ceasefire, when they talk about the need to eradicate Hamas at all costs, they are not thinking of these people as human beings. Because if they truly were, if they had to look family members of those killed in the eyes as they said these words, they would simply not be able to say them. And this is precisely the issue. From behind shiny, waxed podiums, many in the international community are treating these people as political pawns rather than human beings. They make their speeches whilst the daily reality on the ground is bleak beyond belief. In the past month, Israel has conducted siege strategies of collective punishment against over 2 million people. It has undertaken the forcible transfer of over 1 million civilians from North Gaza, and it has bombarded civilians on an unimaginable scale. In the United Kingdom, we have a particularly unique relationship with Israel and Palestine. Talking about historical context is so often dismissed as being stuck in the past, but without looking backwards to acknowledge our role, we can't begin to move forward. The United Kingdom's colonial history in this region does mean that it has a lasting responsibility in relation to the current violence. And yet what we have seen in the past month has been a shirking of this responsibility by leading politicians in both the UK government and the opposition. Both the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition spoke about Israel's unequivocal right to defend itself in the days following the October 7th attack. The word unequivocal is so dangerous to use in this context, essentially handing a carte blanche to Israel to respond disproportionately. It is no wonder that since then, we have seen Israel commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, and indeed, potentially genocide. It has happened whilst the world has watched casually on. I'm hesitant to describe it as indifference because the word indifference almost undermines the active complicity of these actions by British politicians. But that is the reality of the situation. UK government complicity is clear and well established. The UK government is a long-standing provider of military support to Israel through UK arms exports. UK industry provides 15% of the components in the F-35 stealth combat aircraft that is being used to bombard Gaza as we speak. The contract for these components is estimated by the Campaigns Against Arms Trade to be worth £336 million since 2016. So the UK government case is clear, but as well as the action by the government, the language of the opposition has shown complicity too. Building on the Prime Minister's unequivocal support for Israel, Labour leader Keir Starmer refused to condemn the cutting off of water and electricity to an entire population of over 2 million people by saying, "I think that Israel does have that right." He eventually backtracked and denied that he meant what he said, but unfortunately for him, there is video evidence of him saying it. One of the cruelest ironies about the UK's weak response is how simple the correct response actually is. Israel's systematic violations of the rights of Palestinians under international law is long-standing. They may have been particularly acute in this past month, but they have not come out of a vacuum. If the UK, and indeed other members of the international community, had called for an equal application of a rules-based accountability system to both Israelis and Palestinians entrenched in international humanitarian law, we would simply not be in this situation. Unfortunately, it has not. Time and time again, Israel has been singled out in the global order and uniquely exempted from accountability for its violations of international law. We saw this with the crime of apartheid across the occupied Palestinian territories, as evidenced in reports by the likes of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. We saw this with the blockade of Gaza since 2007. And we are seeing it now with the daily war crimes and crimes against humanity that are taking place. With over 10,000 Palestinians killed in just 1 month, how many more must die before the international community takes a stand to protect these people's lives?
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, this is the 1 million, as they said, the million question, because everyone is asking when is this gonna be done and what is the price. Okay, we move to Alicia Kotsouliris. Is that right? That's a Greek name. Yeah, the mic, it's off next to you.
Yes, it is Greek. Thank you.
Yeah. The communication director at Partners for Palestine. You have the mic. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I appreciate that, and thank you for the time with the other speakers. I think it's very important to note that on October 7th, what happened was not the beginning of something, but a reaction to something. The occupation has been oppressing the Palestinians in the West Bank for over 56 years, and the blockade in Gaza for 16. Basically, what happened was a jailbreak, and Hamas was clear in the beginning, even though it was not something that we heard a lot in Western media, but they were very clear that their actions, not to justify that, what they had done that day, but they said it was in reaction to the ongoing occupation, the way that the Palestinian prisoners are being treated in the military courts in the occupied West Bank, and also the recent attacks in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where this is supposed to be a place of sanctuary and a safe place, but there's been a number of raids in the area in the past couple of months. So they weren't sitting around looking for something to do that afternoon. Like I said, this was a reaction to decades of oppression and not being able to live freely and with dignity in their homelands. The constant rhetoric of Israel has the right to defend itself. There's no place in international law that says that that an occupying power has the right to defend itself. In fact, it's the responsibility of that occupying power to take care of and maintain the well-being of the community that they're occupying. So technically, it's the Palestinians that have the right to defend themselves against their occupier. And with $3.8 billion of U.S. aid going into Israel on a yearly basis, with that much money, and they still, we're sending them that much aid, and they still can't get their house in order, so to speak. The U.S. government, their solution to that is to send more money and to send more military aid. And this is clearly not going to solve the issue. The issue is that the Palestinian people want to live free and with dignity, just like anybody else, not just in their region, but as we live here in the United States. But instead, what we're watching is the U.S. government basically fueling a genocide. And as Adam had said before with Rwanda, as we're all sitting around debating what to call it, or if we can call it a genocide, in the meantime, people are dying. And it's not soldiers on the battlefield, it's civilians. What are we at? Over 4,000 children have died in over a month. That's that's despicable that we are continuing to fuel that as the United States. We have the ability to move the needle on this conflict, and instead of putting the money that we have, or the aid that we have available to things like food and water and medical supplies, we're just fueling the ongoing genocide. And it's heartbreaking to watch that, because like I said, in Rwanda, they killed, it was estimates as high as 800,000 people in 3 months. That's at a faster rate than the Nazis were exterminating people in Europe during World War II. And that was in a 3-month period. So how many Palestinians are we going to allow to be victims of this atrocity, as people are sitting by, like I said, and just trying to debate what to call it? And now our own elected officials, they're not allowed to speak out in defense of the Palestinians, which I don't think a lot of Americans know. But when we talk about the Palestinian communities, that's Muslim communities and Christian communities. A church was bombed, a church that's over 1,000 years old. That was a target. The Israeli government has the most sophisticated weapon systems in the world, backed by the largest military force in the world, and they can't tell the difference between a military target and a civilian location. So it's shameful to watch our elected officials, and as they continue to support this. So I would encourage for any folks that are watching in the United States and have an opportunity, we need to start reaching out to our elected officials and let them know that this is not how we want to be featured in the world stage, and this is not how we want our tax dollars spent. And if they don't make a difference and stand up on the right side of history, then we will vote them out and find somebody else who will.
Exactly. Thank you for your words and participation. We go now to Muhammad Jamil, AHOR Chairman, UK Chairman. Mr. Muhammad. Hello. Seems Mr. Muhammad is not with us.
I'm with you.
Yeah. Mr.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Now I can see. Yes, it's the logo here. Okay. Arab Organization. Okay, for Human Rights in UK. Yes,
thank you very much. Just allow to share from my time 1 minute to mourn the value of the Western, the value of whole, give solid green light to commit these atrocities. I will not ever mourn the victims of Palestine. I will not ever, never mourn those killed in Gaza because they are brave. I only can stand up for them and creating them and do all my effort to support them with all means. These people who struggle since 100 years deserve the right to self-defense, not Israel. When we look at the policymakers in the West, we see they fall hostages to the events of 7th of October. And no, we don't know who can free them. When Blinken in Jordan asked, 10,000 not enough to stop this bloody war? 10,000 not enough to stop this madness? He escaped. He escaped and go to drop tears on the Israelis and start talking about the 7th of October. It's time to pass these events. It's time to put an end to this genocide. Don't undermine the people in the streets in the Middle East. If you undermine the regime in the Middle East and find that they are in your pocket, don't undermine the people there. There is something will happen. They will not be expected. Learn the lesson from Afghanistan, from Iraq. I'm not surprised by the way, I'm not surprised by the position of the West. These are dictatorship regimes with a mask of democracy. You see what happened after the things happened after 7 October. They try their best until now to wash the crimes of Israel. They try to wash all these atrocities committed in the daylight. But do they succeed? No. No. We are moving from massacre to massacre, and until now, they call it self-defense when they call it bloody shed, when they call it genocide. Why they don't listen? They are human. They are bleeding. They are crying. Children, women. In the 21st century, how we allow these atrocities to happen? After the Second War, they lied to us. They said, never again. And it is again and again and again. We should, with all a human being in this world, to explore the way to put a pressure on these cowards. How we can push them to stop. Which mechanism we can use. There is a session called the emergency session in the General Assembly, which replaced the Security Council, with the Security Council take any measures threat the security and peace in the world. They go there and they put a proposal draft resolution, but this born dead because it hasn't any mechanism. The session is still open. Any state can go there and reopen it with a powerful draft calling to impose ceasefire by using force under the United Nations umbrella. But this needs superpowers to do it. Shall we call China, Russia, whatsoever? It happened in 1956 when France and Britain attacked Egypt and Israel. It happens in Namibia. But when it comes to Palestine, we saw that the international law is funny. The United Nations is more funny. Just the General Secretary express his worries. It's a great. They exhaust all the terms of worries by the way in the dictionary. There is no other terms now still available. So, as a human being, I always, since the start of this tragedy, ask myself, how can we stop this? How can we stop this this fire not to extend to the whole region? Because you know, the decision makers don't care. Just Blinken, like I don't want to use the terms. He moved from country to another to ask them, don't extend the violence, don't do that. Meanwhile, he gave a green light, solid green light to Israel to wipe Gaza from the map. And this is what happened. in the 21st century, people in Gaza now, right now, while I'm talking to you, they don't find a drink, water for a drink, food. Isn't it that shameful? In all means, what is the funny things in the West? The politicians always fighting each other in the parliaments, in the ruler party and the opposition. The only thing I found they agree, only Israel. When Israel do anything, they give the green light and approve whatever Israel do. So what we can do? The International Justice of Court, its doors is opened. Any state believe in values, believe in the rule of law, can go there and ask the International Court of Justice to impose provisions to stop this genocide. But until now, among 193 states, no one do that. The General Assembly in its 10th emergency session still open. Just someone need a state to call it to resume and put strong resolution to stop this tragedy under the umbrella of the United Nations. The situation in Gaza need more decisive measures to stop this genocide. Otherwise, Israel will continue what it has started with. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed Jamil. We go to the last speech now, and then we'll have questions after that. Mr. Ken Roth, esteemed American attorney, human rights activist, and writer. Yes, sir, you have the mic. We are not listening. Wait, sir.
Okay.
Yes, now.
Okay, good. All right. No, thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry I was not able to attend all of this. I had teaching obligations, but I'm glad to be here now. I thought that I could contribute by trying to outline how I see international humanitarian law applying to the events of the last month plus. And let me begin with the Hamas attack of October 7th, which was clearly just blatant war crimes. Basic premises of humanitarian law are you cannot attack civilians, you cannot fire indiscriminately into civilian populated areas, you cannot abduct civilians and hold them hostage. So these are, not even controversial, they're just like blatant war crimes. Some people have been reluctant to acknowledge that, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge it because, the same law that outlines Israel's obligations in bombing and besieging Gaza also apply to Hamas. And we have to be very careful, not to apply these laws just to one side and not the other, or else we end up undermining the standards. Now, one basic rule of humanitarian law is that war crimes by one side do not justify war crimes by the other. So even though we posit that Hamas has committed war crimes on October 7th, that does not justify Israel just ripping up the Geneva Conventions and proceeding as if they had, no relevance whatsoever. There's also been some talk about, does Israel have a right to respond militarily? And, let's just, again, posit that, there's both a right to, resist occupation, and there's a right to respond to violence. And, we could argue endlessly the relative merits of those, but in terms of humanitarian law, it doesn't matter. The justice of one's cause does not affect the obligation to abide by humanitarian law. So even if we accept that, both Hamas and the Israeli government feel that, justice was on their side, that doesn't entitle either of them to flout the standards of humanitarian law. Now, in looking at these requirements with respect to Israeli conduct, let me outline a few. I mean, the Israeli government likes to say, oh, we're not targeting civilians. That's what Hamas says. And whether or not that's true, that's just, one of multiple humanitarian law obligations. And notably, the Israeli government really doesn't like to go much further than that. So I'll outline a few that I see the Israeli government violating, quite regularly. One is the duty not to fire indiscriminately into civilian populated areas, meaning that if there are kind of military targets dispersed in a civilian area, the requirement is that you target those military targets individually in a precise way, not that you target the entire area. And while the Israeli government is not really offering explanations for most of its attacks, when you look at how it's just been, leveling entire neighborhoods, when you look at the huge proportion of just civilian housing that's been decimated in Gaza, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that the Israeli government is firing indiscriminately, at least at times. The other rule that probably is implicated more regularly is the rule against firing even at a recognized military target if the civilian consequences will be disproportionate. And I think the perfect example of that is the Jabalia refugee camp, where let's even accept Israel's premise, their accusation that Hamas had a command center of some sort underneath the refugee camp. That does not justify using multiple 2,000-pound bombs in the middle of a heavily populated area, which was quite obviously, quite predictably going to have huge civilian consequences, resulting in massive civilian death and injury. And I just have a hard time coming up with any argument that would suggest that the concrete military advantage to Israel from going after this command center or these particular tunnels would justify that huge civilian toll. So, I'm brought to the conclusion that this was a disproportionate attack. I mean, other illustrations of this, we've seen Israel doing this time what they've done in prior wars, which is, giving warning with respect to the residents of a particular high-rise apartment building, and then bombing the building. And, the argument is, oh, there was a Hamas presence somewhere in the building. And again, let's assume that that's true. What kind of Hamas presence would justify suddenly rendering 100 families homeless? Very difficult to come up with a justification that would not find that attack as being disproportionate. And we see these attacks over and over. The other rule that there's been much discussion about is the duty to allow access to humanitarian aid for a civilian population in need. And there's no question that the Palestinian population, the civilian population of Gaza is in need. Not only has it been living under a 16-year blockade, but now, for over a month, it's been living under the siege with, the vast majority of food, electricity, medicine, fuel, etc., blocked. Now, the Israeli government has been letting in drips and drabs of humanitarian aid. I think the latest count is, that over the last month, 500 trucks have been allowed in. To put that in perspective, there were 500 trucks every single day traveling into Gaza. So, we're dealing with what, 1/30 of the needs of the people being met. And of course, the stories you hear from people in Gaza are of severe deprivation. And, particularly the hospitals that don't even have the fuel to run their generators to provide the most minimal care for people. Desalination plants don't have the fuel needed to provide water, and Israel has turned off the water and turned off the electricity, much of it which had been supplied from Israel. So this too is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. Now, I wanted to address two defenses that the Israeli government typically puts forward. One is that Hamas is using human shields to try to render certain military targets untouchable, unattackable, or the related one that Hamas is firing from or fighting from heavily populated areas, thereby endangering the civilian population. And again, I assume that that is true at times. But the important point to stress is that just because Hamas may be committing a war crime there does not, as I said earlier, justify Israel committing a war crime in turn. And the duty of the attacker in every single attack is to avoid indiscriminate attacks, to avoid disproportionate attacks. And so the mere fact that Hamas, might be using human shields does not alleviate the duty on Israel's part not to fire if the civilian consequences are going to be disproportionate. And so this, human shield argument tends to be more of a political argument. It doesn't justify the large civilian costs that we are seeing in Gaza. Now, the other argument that defenders of the Israeli government frequently make is, Israel's giving warnings. And, humanitarian law does require the giving of what's called an effective advance warning, if possible. And so it's, to Israel's credit that it's giving warnings. I mean, this time around, it tends to be much less specific warnings. Sometimes it is, get out of this building, we're going to bomb it. But as you all know, the big warning was get out of northern Gaza. 1.1 million people, just, go south. And, it's worth noting that there, even though there may be a humane impetus behind this, and I guess you can debate, whether it was humanity or political goals here, but this was done in a very inhumane way because it wasn't safe to move south. The bombing largely continued even along the route south. It certainly continued in the south. So, it may not have been as intense as in the north, but it's not as if Israel's been refraining from bombing in the south. And the south was as subject to the siege, had been as subject to the 16-year blockade as the north. So, suddenly 1 million people are supposed to show up. How are they going to be received? Where is the basic food, medicine, water, not to mention electricity, not to mention housing, where are they going to go? And there are no good answers to this. The Israeli government has adamantly refused even a humanitarian pause that, might have allowed some of these issues to be addressed. So this, is not a terribly humane way to proceed. The other big concern is, I would draw really from what happened in 2006 in the conflict in southern Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah, where the Israeli government also issued warnings of this sort. If you're a civilian, get out of southern Lebanon. And what we found there, much as what we're finding in Gaza now, is that some people go, but some people stay. And the reasons why people would stay are varied. They may be elderly, they may have a disability, they may be too poor to move. It's gotten very expensive to move from northern to southern Gaza. Taxis are, way beyond what they used to be. They may be afraid to move because the bombing is happening around them. They may just not want to leave their home, and in the case of, northern Gaza, the added reason is people don't want to, leave and never be able to go back. Everybody knows about the Nakba, and, 70% of the population is the descendant of Nakba victims. And there is this real fear that, even if it's just northern Gaza to southern Gaza, they may never get to go back.
Yes.
So
yes.
there are lots of
yes. Sorry because we're gonna go back to you with these questions, and this is very important. Why people sometimes they don't want to move to the southern part of Gaza because they have their imagination. They still have the Nakba term, yes. And this mythology is very hard for them. Mr. Ismail, with a quick, Muhammad Ismail, the director of Egyptians Abroad for Democracy, with a quick sentences, please, before we go to the questions, because the time is attacking us.
Okay, it's actually to a couple of comments and question as well. To Mr. Kenneth, first of all, I want to thank you very much for being part of Human Rights Watch, and you guys do a great job for human being in general. You mentioned at the beginning that about who started, what's human rights violation and things about Hamas and others. But I wanted to ask a couple of questions if you want to take this as a note, and then after that you can answer me later on. What do you consider settlers civilians, the people that they set and take the lands of Palestinians against their own will, do you consider them civilians or not? And based on your answer, we'll know if the Palestinian or the Palestinian resistance, they deal with civilians or not, or they violate human rights or not. And then, do the Palestinian have the right to resist or no? Or only the Israeli, as we hear from Blinken all the time, they have the right to defend themselves, while the Palestinians don't have the right to resist. At the end, and then the last thing I wanted to say, why do we not put pressure on Egypt? When I say Egypt, I don't mean the people of Egypt, because the people of Egypt here, they're willing to help the people of Palestine. They can do anything possible to help the people of Palestine. But, as you know, from Human Rights Watch, the people of Egypt cannot even demonstrate, cannot even protest. They like to walk to the border and help their brother and sister. According to the international law, Egypt's supposed to be open the gates, not because it's not upon Israel or upon General Sisi to let this happen. Why do we not put pressure on General Sisi? Unless if he's part of the conspiracy. I'm not a believer of the conspiracy theory, but I can see it as you heard everyone talking about that we want to displace the people of Gaza to go to Sinai. That making me feel that what's happening is part of the conspiracy to move them on the side of Sinai to end the right of return. I mean, I'm done speaking here. I have other comments to say, but this is enough for what you just mentioned, and I hope you can answer me on that. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. With the quick questions, Mr. Jim Moran, what do you think the actions could the international community take to prevent the systematic actions against civilians in Gaza? What do you think? The mic, please. The mic. Again, yeah. Okay, I'll try to unmute. Okay, now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I don't think the international community is going to do anything of consequence. They're intimidated by the United States and by the general media in Europe and the United States. So I think they're going to stand by and watch this occur and wring their hands in frustration. I appreciate all of the people who are willing to speak out on this call. But I don't have any real any confidence that things are going to change, because Bibi Netanyahu has gotten his will whenever he has chosen to confront the West, regardless of what he has done. I think what they want to do is to relocate virtually the entire Gazan population to someplace in the Sinai, to take over that property. I think it may be that the only thing that's going to stop that is if this conflict if there's a real threat for this conflict to widen. I don't necessarily see that. As long as Saudi Arabia, the Emirates particularly, as long as they continue their policy of throwing the Palestinians under the bus, regardless of what the people on the street, as they say, think about it, nothing's going to happen. The Arab world has to unite. The Muslim world has to unite. I would hope that it would not be in a violent form, but somehow there has to be collective action against what is happening. Otherwise, it goes down in history as not just the Israelis being culpable for this, but the whole world. Accept responsibility for what they're allowing to happen.
So what are the obstacles to recognize and responding to these acts as genocide on a global scale, and how can they be overcome? Like, if I asked Mr. Jonathan Purcell, what would you say?
Could you repeat that question, please? What
are the obstacles to recognizing and responding to these acts as genocide on a global scale?
I think we haven't even got anywhere near that so far. Before we even get there, there's so many initial things that international actors have to recognize. Haven't got past calling for a ceasefire instead of a humanitarian pause, for instance. I mean, surely that is the very, very first step that needs to take place. But if we're talking about legal terminology, which includes but is not restricted to genocide, then it's clear that the political appetite amongst many in the international community is not there. And therefore, legal channels are something that, you know, needs to be considered by activists and change makers outside of the political elite in certain countries. So I won't speak directly on genocide in this particular example, just because it's not something that has taken place yet in a legal capacity. But to give an example of what ICJP, my organization, has done, is put a notice of intention to prosecute UK politicians for their role in aiding and abetting war crimes and crimes against humanity. As cases build, other international crimes can be considered also. But I think that this legal challenge is quite an important route. Under the Rome Statute, it doesn't simply have to be Israeli politicians who are directly conducting these war crimes. The aiding and abetting of war crimes by the complicity of international actors can in turn result in their own complicity. So that is quite an interesting space that can be considered if there is continued reluctance from the global international community, which sadly, as it stands, seems to be continuing.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Ken Roth, I was going to ask you to answer some questions that appears from Mr. Muhammad.
I'd be happy to do that.
When he was asking about, do we consider like what is civilians and these, settlers? And it's kind of framing also inside the media, like is it what happened is resistance or not? So all these questions. Yes, sir.
Okay. I mean, first on the resistance question, I mean, obviously there's, both sides can claim, a right to military action. The Palestinians to resist occupation, the Israelis to resist violent attack. As I say, none of that matters with respect to the duty by both sides to comply with international humanitarian law. With respect to the settlers, the settlements themselves are violations of humanitarian law. They're actually war crimes. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits an occupying power from transferring its population to occupied territory. So that's what the settlements are. So that's a clear grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. It's a war crime. That doesn't make the settlers themselves into legitimate targets or combatants. Most settlers are just civilians who are living there. They're, you could say they shouldn't live there because they were part of this transfer, but there's nothing in there that makes them legitimate military targets. They are protected civilians. The only exception to that would be settlers who take up arms and who, in a sense, become, a part of the Israeli Defense Forces or, an informal militia. But leaving aside that narrow category of people, the settlers personally cannot be attacked. It's a war crime to attack them. Now, with respect to Egypt, you're absolutely right. We should be pressuring the Egyptian government. The Egyptian government has been a critical partner of the Israeli government in enforcing the blockade for 16 years, and now in enforcing the siege. And so we tend to say, the Israeli government is doing this. That's actually a mistake. It's the Israeli government and the Egyptian government working together that are imposing these conditions on Gaza. If the Egyptian government was not doing that, there would not be, a blockade of Gaza. There would be, free economic development, or much freer at least. So we should, put blame on Sisi. And indeed, he is very opposed to Hamas. I mean, not just because of Hamas's resort to violent attacks on civilians, but also because Hamas, is a more violent branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which in Egypt, as we remember, was the party that, Morsi used to win the only free and fair election Egypt has had. And, Sisi is terrified of the Muslim Brotherhood and has done everything he could to crush it domestically. So, the same Sisi who oversaw the slaughter of 817 Muslim Brotherhood sit-in protesters in Rabbah Square is the one who is, backing the Israeli government now as it bombs Palestinian civilians.
Mr. Kenroth, here the election brought me back to the point where Hamas won the election in 2006, and it was faced by this blockade by the West, not recognizing even the most fresh democratic in Palestine. So what do you think about that?
Well, Hamas won the election in 2006. I mean, I think both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are rightfully criticized for refusing to ever have another election again. Hamas has turned into a military dictatorship in Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority is terrified of an election because they're afraid that they would lose. And so you've got this, increasingly elderly, corrupt body that has effectively become a subcontractor of the Israeli government, that is, very little legitimacy left. This was, of course, by design of the Israeli government. I mean, Netanyahu has been quite open about liking the fact that Hamas was dominant because Hamas was never seen as a potential partner in peace negotiations. He liked the fact that the Palestinian Authority was totally discredited and weak because it would, therefore nobody would be there to negotiate a two-state solution, which gradually has died as the settlements have expanded. And indeed, the settlement expansion has added to the discrediting among many Palestinians of the Palestinian Authority. So there, are two leading bodies, neither of which is much of a partner for negotiating peace, which was just what Netanyahu wanted, because he wanted to keep the occupation in perpetuity. And it was that endless occupation, the lack of any prospect of a peace process, that led Human Rights Watch to say that this oppressive discrimination that we found in the occupied territory wasn't just a passing phenomenon that would be resolved through this endless and really non-existent peace process, but it was rather apartheid.
Hey, can I just say something here, please, if you don't mind, to Kenneth as well? I just, what leverage, this is a couple of things. What leverage do we have on Egypt or on Sisi to make him, I mean, we don't want to just blame him, but what leverage we have? Mm-hmm. This is number one. The second thing, you talk about the sit-in and Rabbah Square. I was there. I'm not Muslim Brotherhood. I'm actually against Muslim Brotherhood, but not all of them Muslim Brotherhood, the one they were killed or smashed as well. Mm-hmm. So this is the two things I just wanted to highlight. So go for it, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, sure. I mean, just in terms of your point, what leverage? I mean, the U.S. gives Egypt, what, $1.3 billion in military aid every year. Biden, $235 million of that is explicitly by legislation conditioned on certain, human rights practices. The Sisi government failed those miserably, and Biden just let the money go through anyhow. And Sisi has been very adept at saying, don't push me on my repression because I'm helping Israel maintain the blockade and now the siege. So let me go with my repression. And, Biden has fallen for that. European governments, it's a slightly different calculation. Sisi says, I'll keep migrants away from the Mediterranean, just keep my money coming. And so Sisi in this very cynical way has learned how to play Western governments to downplay his repression in return for things that they want. And how do we put pressure on Sisi? The best way is to put pressure on Western governments and just show the hypocrisy behind their ongoing support for what is really the most repressive, brutal government in Egypt's modern history.
So would that mean that we don't really have leverage? What we have is just the pressure of the people. Yeah, I mean, it's important to have this kind of dialogue because Kenneth is an important person to be. I mean, everybody's important, but he's at the head of Human Rights Watch and he has a direct, he's hands-on in Egypt, he's hands-on in Palestine. So it's an opportunity for us to...
Let me highlight this. Hello?
Yes, Mr. Muhammad Jamil.
I don't want to go and academic discussion or technical issues. This need the civilian shields, the the classification of the factions in Palestine. Let me stress that the majority of the Israelis are armed, not civilians. 350,000 reserves called to this war. Who are these? They are settlers, they are citizens, they are... so what is the stand of the international law here? Ben Gvir, when this war started, he distributed arms to all settlers. And before that, we see the settlers, how they attack the Palestinians, how they burn Hawara, killed people, attack them in the day and night. There is a lot of questions here about big question mark about the self-defense, the reaction of the occupation. Is the occupation until now, after 60 years, have the right of this defense? This is a question must be answered now by the International Justice Court. There is a case in front of it and must be answered in front of special ad hoc court must formed to look at all crimes. I'm not worried about this, and we will have clear answers about the position of these crimes committed by the settlers, the army, everyone in this regime.
Mr. Mohammed, I would like to pass this question.
I want to stress something very clearly. The Palestinians have all the right. If there is a lot of questions on the rights of the occupation in the international law. But in the international law, there is no questions whatsoever that the Palestinians have the right to self-defense, have the right to resist.
Okay. Alicia, what do you think? I would like to pass part of these questions to you.
Just to kind of echo what the other folks were saying, the settlers are civilians, but they are there illegally. So, like I said previously, not to justify any kind of violence towards them, if they shouldn't be there in the first place. So that's part of the ongoing problem, is having the occupation in place and allowing the settlers to move in to into the Palestinian land. I mean, that's not if we allow that to continue to happen, then we're not going to get to a place where anybody's going to find peace. And I know that that there's parts of the Jewish community that are living in Israel proper that they understand that the occupation is part of the ongoing problem, and they don't support the government's continued support of allowing the settlements to take place and the occupation to keep happening. So I mean, it doesn't benefit anybody, because the violence will continue as long as the blockade is still in place on the Gaza Strip and the occupation is in place for the occupied West Bank.
Yes, I see this. If the United Nations decisions has been followed accurately, there will not be settlements. They were all illegal settlements in West Bank. And so, Mr. Adam Shapiro, you still with us?
Yes.
Yeah, so do you think what are the long-term implications for international human rights? The situation in Gaza remains unaddressed by global powers. If you're going to
I mean, it's hard to say about the long-term.
You have the right to comment if you want and answer the question.
Just in terms of the other questions, I think what's being mixed up here to some extent is what is permissible under international humanitarian law versus what is the political sort of position of different groups and how they carry out their attacks and what tactics they use. The first about international humanitarian law, who's a civilian, who's not a civilian, who's a legitimate target, who's not a legitimate target, all of those things are fairly well clearly laid out and represent the limitation of international law, frankly, because we also have to understand the context in which these laws were written at the time, who wrote them, and what interest they also represented at the time. And that's a whole different theoretical approach. Just I would only contextualize what the attack on October 7th was to some extent before laying all the blame on Hamas for its attacks. We still don't know who crossed the border, who was under the command of Hamas in terms of the actions that they carried out and who wasn't. And we also don't, and just because Hamas initiated the attack doesn't necessarily mean it as an entity is responsible for everything that occurred subsequently. So there's still a lot of gray area and question marks that have to be investigated. Furthermore, I would also add, because I think the word settlement has now been used at least in two different contexts, one to represent the target of the attacks on October 7th and some other, and again to represent the settlements in the West Bank. And there is a genuine, legitimate, at least one pathway to argue that the kibbutzes that were attacked were indeed settlements, in part because they were located in lands that Israel annexed subsequent to the 1949 armistice, what's called the Gaza envelope. And furthermore, Israel located military bases either in or adjacent to the settlements in some ways, which could be argued, and I have seen at least one or two legal scholars arguing this, that in effect is Israel's use of civilian, what often Hamas gets accused of using human shields, civilian shields, that Israel's tactic, and this exists throughout the land of Israel and Palestine, Israel places military bases in civilian locations. And it does so, in this is true in the north, this is true in the West Bank, in order to basically combine military and civilian into one effective area. So there are still questions that can be asked about this, and there are questions that lawyers can debate and get into. In terms of the future, for Gaza, in terms of human rights and Palestine in general, I would, the question was asked, what can the international community do? And I agree about the skepticism that's been, expressed so far. However, I do think there might be a couple of spaces where action could be taken with the right kind of pressure that wouldn't necessarily cost states too much in terms of what they'd be willing to risk in order to make it happen. One is, and somebody mentioned the International Criminal Court, and while the investigation into what's currently happening is something that is potentially ongoing and needs to happen, there has been sufficient evidence already presented to the court by the United Nations about another incident that happened in Gaza called the Gaza March of Return, the Great March of Return, in which thousands of people were injured, hundreds were killed, in what has been well documented as explicit orders to shoot to kill against civilians, protected civilians. This is a case that the prosecutor could act on now. And I believe that state pressure addressing that could be effective for two reasons. One, it changes the narrative somewhat about Palestinian resistance, about the idea that Palestinians are only violent, that the Palestinians have never tried to be, peaceful, peaceful resistance, etc. And some of the same potential perpetrators from the Gaza March of Return, from the Israeli side, people who were in command positions, are also now in command positions vis-a-vis what's happening in Gaza right now. So there is a potential utility in pursuing justice and accountability for something that happened previously in terms of affecting behavior potentially now and changing the narrative around this entirely. That, getting the ICC prosecutor to act on the Palestine file has been obviously very difficult up until now. However, we know from talking to people and from hearing, what we're hearing, that just as there have been cracks and dissent inside the US administration and the bureaucracy, in the State Department and in the US Embassy in Jerusalem and other places, Defense Department, where people who work in these institutions are now directly and not quite publicly, but it's being publicly reported, dissenting with the administration leadership. And that's causing an internal pressure that has been unprecedented, really, in a lot of ways, at least maybe since the days of Vietnam in the United States. Similarly, we're hearing that in the ICC, people who are working in the office of the prosecutor and in the court system are very disgruntled and unhappy with the way the prosecutor has handled the Palestine file up until now. And that has only escalated as a result of what's happening recently. So there is potentially pressure that could be leveraged to move something forward in terms of accountability, which wouldn't be, it wouldn't be insignificant. It wouldn't stop what's happening now, but it wouldn't be insignificant. And then the second thing also, and this gets to the question about the future of human rights. Prior to all of this happening, there's been interest in South Africa and some other countries to restart the UN's Office on Apartheid, the Committee on Apartheid, and to focus, to establish it generally, but obviously the situation of Israel, thanks in part to the reports that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and Israeli organizations and Palestinian organizations have put out about apartheid, that this, I think the opportunity space for that to be renewed and for states to go ahead and authorize that through the General Assembly, I think that the chances of actually now are much higher than they were before. And that also wouldn't be insignificant. Again, it wouldn't stop what's happening right now, but in terms of the longer term is quite a useful thing, I think, to happen.
Yes, as I see. Okay. Unfortunately, Mr. Joram Van, thank you, Mr. Adam Shapiro. Unfortunately, Mr. Joram Van is not available, but he has a recorded speech. Can we have it, please, guys? Petition and a former parliament, Dutch parliament, yes.
Good morning, assalamu alaikum, and thanks for the invitation, although it's a very, very sad and worrying topic, of course. Lately, I often get the question from people outside the West, why so many Westerners support Israel? And that is, I think, a very good question, because even a lot of Westerners don't know the answer. One has to understand that there are many interests here by many people and many groups, and I will talk about three of them. Christian Zionists, secular anti-Islam organizations, and the establishment, which, by the way, is also influenced by the former two. Well, first, the Christian Zionists. A lot of people often think that Zionism started with Theodor Herzl, his book The Jewish State, and the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. But it was the American Rabbi Laser who around 1860, so a couple of years before, proclaimed a message that 30 years later was also discovered by Herzl. And his belief was that the Jewish people would never find safety and tranquility without a country of their own. And it was based on the experiences they had in Europe for centuries already. So this guy, this Jewish rabbi, was the one who changed the views of many Jewish people, especially in the United States, way back. But as early as 1827, so way before that, there was also an Irish Christian preacher called John Darby, who developed a radically different theology than was common until then. He said that the Bible had been misread for over 1500 years. People long believed in what they call the replacement theology. That was that no longer the Jews, but the Christian church, and thus the Christians were the chosen people and thus had God on their side. But the Protestant John, however, took the Bible very literally and based on it stated that the Jews were the direct descendants of Abraham and his grandson Jacob, who would later be called Israel. And thus, despite their rejection of Jesus Christ, they still had an eternal and special relationship with God. The Bible says that the Jews would be scattered over the earth, but would one day return to the homeland, the historical Israel. And Darby believed he could contribute to that cause. And he was very steadfast and convinced, and he decided to proclaim his views also in the New World, which was America. And he was a very successful man. He started a network of evangelical Christians who shared his ideas, and in his final years had a group of very talented preachers around him. Among them were Dwight Moody, who held mass meetings in the United States, and a guy called William Heckler, who eventually went to Theodor Herzl's house in Vienna, Austria, in Europe, and offered him every support and help. And it was also Heckler who opened the political doors for Herzl's lobby. Eventually, they were so successful that over time, this vision became the dominant one. He changed the way millions and millions of Christians viewed the Jewish people. And that has a tremendous impact to this day. So the Christian Zionist support for Israel is very religious in nature. Then there are the secular anti-Islam politicians and organizations. They don't care about the whole religious story. Most of them aren't religious people at all. They actually look at it in a military way and very ideologically. They look at the world from the idea that there is a class of civilizations, the whole theory of Samuel Huntington, where the Western world is threatened by Islam. And terror attacks in Europe, America, or Israel, in their view, are all directed against the broader West and thus part of a broader struggle. They argue that Israel is an advanced Western post in the Middle East, so it's a military base in a way. They, that is Israel, are fighting our fight with the Muslims, and so they support Israel through thick and thin. Views of Palestine, so that the view of Palestine is that Palestine already exists, but it's called Jordan. So they say that the state of Jordan is Palestine, and that is the homeland of the Palestinians. Again, this is the point of view of the anti-Islam organizations and politicians in the West. And then there is the third entity I will talk about in this context of why the West supports Israel and abandons the Palestinians. By the way, this is not about all European countries. Ireland and there are many more countries, for example, they have been very supportive of the Palestinians for decades already. But they are unfortunately an exception. So the establishments of most Western countries align with the United States. In fact, they are, we can call them vassal states. The US has a geopolitical, economic and military interest in the region from World War II. And that is the period when Israel was also founded, a few years later, of course. America boxed up against the Soviet Union and the other way around, the Cold War. Proxy wars were fought in the Middle East. At the same time, oil and gas became increasingly important, and it is abundant in the region, of course. In addition, it's a central place, the Middle East, from which Iran and China also remain accessible. Israel forms a base in this. Current President Joe Biden once said in 1986 in a famous speech that if Israel didn't already exist, America would have had to invent it because of the interest it serves. The billions a year Israel receives, he called the best investment of all time. And the combination of all these actors and their influence in the media and education means that many Westerns are almost brought up with the idea that supporting Israel is the right thing to do. But alhamdulillah, because of the internet and social media, many filters have fallen away and people get different information. And this is slowly turning public opinion. See the many pro-Palestine demonstrations which are attended by an awful lot of people from all walks of life. And inshallah, this development will continue, but we'll see. Thanks again for the invitation, and assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you for your speech and your participation. Everyone, thank you for your participation. We have a unite in Gaza. We hope it will be less bombs and this casualties and this genocide. We hope it's going to be end soon. Everyone, thank you for participation, and we hope to see you in better conditions and talking about what we have achieved against this genocide. Thank you. Thank you for everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.